The Dalai Lama was invited to interact with a group of Christians who practiced Christian meditation. In fact, I'm going to read a little bit out of the book. It was September of 1994 in London. His Holiness the Dalai Lama led the John Main Seminar, an annual international spiritual event held in honor of the Benedictine monk John Main, whom Father B. Griffiths once called the most important spiritual guide in the church today. Now, this was a monk, Catholic monk, who practiced Christian meditation, and very similar to other forms of meditation. And in their mindset, you connect to God by silence, and you sit silently, very much like Hindu or Buddhist meditation, where silence is incorporated as one of the key elements. These Christians would do the same thing. Sometimes they might have you focus on a particular word. One they mentioned was Maranatha, and you would say Maranatha over in your mind as part of your, they sometimes call it contemplative prayer, where you're just quiet and sitting, trying to connect to God. And because the Dalai Lama is one of the most famous Buddhists in the world, and because he had interacted a couple of times briefly with John Main, they thought, why don't we invite him to one of our sessions, but we're going to let him be the lead speaker. And what we're going to do is give him a Bible passage, let him think about it for a little while, and then tell us how it strikes him. And the Dalai Lama is very upfront and says, I haven't studied the Bible like you all have. If you want me to do this, that's fine. I'm happy to do it. But just understand, I'm not a Bible scholar. And so they did it. One thing to understand, and this goes back to our Sunday school that we go to, by the way, and for those of you who are relatively new here, we used to have a Zen Buddhist group here that met on Wednesdays. We did that for about 7 years. COVID really hit it hard, and we never fully recovered from that. But within that time of practice, I will call myself a Zen Buddhist. In particular, I practiced that and found it extremely useful in my life. And, you know, that's known to the folks at First Christian. So they keep looking to me to talk about the Buddhist stuff in this book. And I keep pointing out I'm not a Tibetan Buddhist. And that is one of many branches of Buddhism. Just like Christianity, it's not all one big thing. It's a bunch of smaller subdivisions. And Tibetan Buddhists, it's hard to get an exact percentage. It's a small percentage of all Buddhists. The one actual hard number I was able to find was 2%. Might be bigger than that. So to expect the Dalai Lama to speak for all Buddhists would be like expecting the head of the Jehovah's Witnesses to speak for all Christians. Not only are they different, they're a small percentage, and many don't even call them Christians. Tibetan Buddhism incorporates a great deal of shamanistic belief from Tibet. And Buddhism loves to evolve as it goes to different countries and incorporate things from those countries. So, first of all, the Dalai Lama would never claim to speak for all Buddhists. He speaks about general principles. And I was really impressed in this book how often he will cut through the feel-good stuff and be open and honest about things. One thing that he keeps encountering is these Christians who are very welcoming, very open-minded, and like to sort of blur the differences, will often say, you know, we're pretty much doing the same thing. And they'll say, no, we're really not. We may meditate. Buddhism is different, and he'll point out the differences. That is not the point of this sermon, but I just appreciate the fact that even though he is essentially a celebrity in the world, a religious celebrity, he seems very down to earth, at least in how he interacts in this, seminar. Now, there are two things I wanted to focus on that have struck me over the going through this book, and we're almost finished. One more next Sunday and we're done. By the way, that's why we often get here just before church starts, is because we're at Sunday school, and then we leave there before they're quite finished and get here just in time, usually. So the first thing was the question of faith. And they asked the Dalai Lama to do a passage that talks about faith. And then they asked for him to explain how Buddhists view faith. And I'm going to read a passage out of the book for this. The Tibetan word for faith is depa, which perhaps might be closer in meaning to confidence or trust. In the Buddhist tradition, we speak of 3 different types of faith. This is the key I want to focus on. The first is faith in the form of admiration that you have toward a particular person or a particular state of being. The second is aspiring faith. There is a sense of emulation. You aspire to attain that state of being. A third type is the faith of conviction. Conviction that this can be done, that this can be achieved, that it's not a waste of time, that it's worth your effort. And I will also say that he is very adamant that even though we're using the word faith here, it is not a faith without reason, a faith without foundation. And we contrast this idea of faith, I'll come right back to it in a minute, with the most famous passage about faith probably in the Bible, Hebrews 11:1, which defines faith this way. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And I'm going to say that again. Faith is the assurance of things that you hope for, so it's hope, and the conviction of things not seen, something not seen, something perhaps without evidence. And at least in my Christian upbringing, faith was always this thing that you had to do without proof, that you just had to exercise this faith. In fact, your eternal soul depended on it, that your faith had to be the correct kind of faith, the right faith in the right thing. And evidence was not going to be supplied to you. You had to have this faith. The Dalai Lama would say, no, you use your reason to examine these 3 steps of your faith. So first of all, we have the notion of admiration. And I understand this desire to admire someone or something, and it's admiring someone. And you have to be careful when you admire someone, because being human as we all are, we will eventually make a mistake, perhaps not so eventually for some of us, and repeatedly. And if you are in a position where people are admiring you, and then you do something against expectations, you're going to shatter perhaps their conception of, here's this person I admired, this person I wanted to emulate, this person who has achieved what I hope to achieve. And look, they just blew up and got angry. And they just cussed. They just did something that is totally out of character. I've known this person for years, and now they're acting like this. Yeah, they're acting like a human. And we need to have grace when that happens. But don't set anyone up on a pedestal. You've heard that many times, I'm sure. The reason you hear it is because it's great wisdom. Don't set someone up on a pedestal. And since people tend to let us down, the people we tend to admire are oftentimes historical figures who are dead and can't let us down anymore. So Jesus or the Buddha, Muhammad, or any number of other religious leaders around which a myth has grown up. Jancy and I are watching a PBS documentary, Ken Burns' analysis story of the American Revolution. And boy, all the stuff you were taught growing up about the American Revolution, prepare to have your dreams shattered. Turns out George Washington wasn't a great general. He was great at keeping an army together, but he lost more battles than he won. A lot more. And we're just watching this going, wow, we never heard any of this growing up. This is all, ta-da, Americans rise up and beat the British handily. And this war dragged on for a long time. I was I was a little surprised that we're going into year 6 or 7 now in the last episode. And I didn't realize it went on that long. It was always presented as this, well, uprising of the righteous Americans. Well, there's a great discussion about slavery and how the British were the ones that telling all the slaves, if you come over and fight with us, we'll set you up for freedom and you'll never be a slave again. And it turned out the British were the ones protecting the Indian lands, and the colonists wanted to go out and take all this land from the Indians. It's like, wow, we weren't really all that great. So, the past repeats itself even today as we go out and show that might makes right, or at least we like to say that. Some people like to say that. And I've gotten off on a rabbit trail. So we'll come back to don't admire people if you think they're not going to screw up. Now, people can still have attributes you want to emulate that you would like to achieve. Just understand they're not God's presence on this earth, and they are allowed to make the same mistakes everyone else does. But the problem is when you're admiring someone like a great religious leader, you also tend to make that great religious leader in your own image. So Jesus becomes the epitome of whatever you think is good. And if you think that's not quite right, there are plenty of people who will use the wrath images of Jesus in the Bible, especially in the book of Revelation, where he comes back, fights the battle of Armageddon, where the blood flows as high as a horse's bridle. And they love that Jesus of violence and confrontation and judgment. I've known people like that. And Jesus becomes the epitome of everything you might think is vile. And yet they call themselves Christians. They aspire to be like the Jesus who comes with the sword of judgment. So everyone will build their idolized person or great leader in their own image to reinforce largely what they want to do already. That happens a great deal. Or you aspire or emulate an idea. And I find myself doing this to some degree as I look at what Christianity is often becoming in this world. And I left Christianity a long time ago for theological reasons. But now that Christianity has become this thing that, even for me, strikes me as totally un-Christ-like. That you're poor, well, too bad for you. We wouldn't want the government helping you out. That's up to the churches. Or sure, we can use violence to overthrow a government or attack a country that's doing something we don't like. And that's all in God's will. God is driving our military, which is exactly what's being said by our current Secretary of Defense, not Secretary of War, because that name doesn't get to be changed by the president. Requires an act of Congress. But they have religious services now at the Pentagon. And recently, Jerry Falwell Jr. spoke there and talked about God's not just a God of love, God is a God of wrath. And telling all the military people that they were doing God's will, because look at all that stuff in the Old Testament where God is endorsing violence and commanding violence. And then I look and I think, hey, I just don't see Jesus buying into this. Whoever Jesus was, whatever Jesus was, that's not the message he was preaching. Why is it that the atheist has more respect for what Jesus said than the Christians at this point? And I just throw my hands up. They've made Jesus in the image they want to be. But I like the third point, conviction. Conviction that it's achievable. Instead of setting for yourself an impossible goal set by an impossible person from the past who is utterly perfect, like, I will never sin again. I will never be angry again. I will never say a hurtful word again. That's not achievable, I suspect, for any human being. maybe I'm wrong, but I think we're all going to trip up, all. But have a conviction of something that is achievable. And this is where, if you want to call it faith or hope, aspiration, whatever, I'm going to give you an example in my life that does come from Buddhism. There was a saying by Dogen, who was one of the founders of Japanese Zen Buddhism, the form I practice. And they don't call it meditation, they call it sitting, when you sit quietly, silently. And he said, when you sit, the universe sits with you. Because in Buddhism, you are not separate from everything else. This notion of separateness or self is constantly attacked by Buddhism. It's an illusion. It's what drives a lot of the misery in this world. So I like to take that and stretch it a little bit to say, when you do something good, kind, caring, for the welfare of someone else, when you do that, even if no other human knows it's been done, it resonates throughout the universe. And I've said this in past sermons. Your actions matter, and your actions resonate throughout the universe, throughout all there is. Now, I can't prove that. I'm not going to try to prove that. But I'm going to live as though that is true. And there's reason to believe it is. And by the way, this also works in reverse. When you do harm, you do impact the universe. It's not woo, it's not tinfoil hat stuff. I think it is actually the essential nature of the reality we live in. But whatever your goals are, whoever you or whatever you want to admire, to aspire and emulate, and to have a conviction that it's important and achievable, I encourage you to pursue that without fear of what other people think, or without needing to prove it to anyone else. Just be careful, like I said, about who you admire or what you admire. Now, again, the Dalai Lama would say these three elements of faith must be derived from reason. So you test them. You see if they make a difference in your life. You see if there's any reason for you to continue on this path. And so that's where I'm going to stop with faith. But that was a very interesting discussion of faith from a very different approach than I was used to. Now, the second thing I want to talk about, and I'm going to put Jancy on the spot. I shared with her what happened on one Sunday that she didn't go. And I said, yeah, they were talking about heaven and hell and how it's not literal, it's figurative. And she said, why do they always lie? I said, well, I'm pretty sure the guy believed what he said. Yes, but he was speaking for Christians, wasn't he? Well, yeah, I guess in that context he was. So here's the context, and you get to hear the conversation. The Dalai Lama asks Father Lawrence, who's the guy running the show, what is the Christian meaning of heaven? Father Lawrence: heaven is the experience of sharing the joy, the peace, and love of God to the fullness of human capacity. The Dalai Lama: so there's not necessarily an association with a physical space? Father Lawrence: no, only in dreams. The Dalai Lama: similarly, can one by extension understand the notion of hell also in terms of a very negative, deluded state of mind? Father Lawrence: yes, certainly. The Dalai Lama: you can see the gears going in the Dalai Lama's head. So that means we need not to think of heaven and hell in terms of an external environment? Father Lawrence: no, hell would be the experience of separation from God, which in itself is unreal. It is illusory because nothing can be separated from God. However, if we think we are separated from God, then we are in hell. Now remember, we're having a dialogue between Christians and Buddhists, and at no point does Father Lawrence say, this is not the only view within Christianity, or this is my view, but there are other views. He presents it as a given. There's no physical heaven or hell. It's all about a state of mind and how you're living on this earth. And going back to Yancey's question, why do they always lie? I don't know if Father Lawrence really thinks all Christians believe this. I doubt it. He can't possibly believe that. Maybe he doesn't include believers in literal heaven and hell as Christians. I don't know. But this brings me to another point. In dialogue, be honest. When you are speaking for yourself, don't pretend to be speaking for others. A phrase I like to use a lot when we were doing our Zen group, we'd often read a passage out of a book and I'd say, that is the teaching. I'm not saying this is the truth. I don't know if it's the truth, but it is a teaching. If Father Lawrence says heaven and hell are states of mind, say, this is my belief that heaven and hell are states of mind. Others do believe that they're physical locations in space and time where people do have bliss or suffer eternally. And I was a little surprised, really, especially after Yancey gave me her 2 cents worth, that, yeah, he really did present it as this is the answer, not this is how I understand it. And when you're in realms of areas where people have great disagreements, and frankly, even in a collection of people in a Unitarian Universalist congregation, you are going to have people with widely different views. And we are well trained, I think, after week in and week out of meeting with people whose views are different from ours, that we do sort of couch our discussions in, I think this, or I believe this, or this is my understanding. I think that's very critical when you're having a religious discussion of this nature. And when you're in a seminar like this, where you have been invited in from another religious tradition, and he asks you point blank about heaven and hell, I think you need to give a better answer than what Father Lawrence did. And he's not here to defend himself, so all respect to Father Lawrence. At least he doesn't think God tortures people for all eternity in a literal hell. So I'll give him credit for that. And I also give him credit for saying, we're going to have a Buddhist come in, read some scriptures cold, think on them for a couple hours, and tell us what he thinks. Pretty gutsy, really. Most Christian churches or organizations wouldn't do that. So kudos to them for that. Kudos to the Dalai Lama for constantly saying over and over, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff that we share, but we're different. We are different. And you cannot lose sight of that either. It doesn't mean one's right or wrong or that one's better than the other, but they aren't the same thing. And sometimes you slip into this, well, we're all on the same mountain going up different paths to the top. And he would say, well, no, not exactly. Doesn't mean I disrespect the path you're on, but our paths aren't going to the same place, at least in our minds they're not. And we can talk more about that in the second hour. In any case, that's all I've got for you. Glad I could fill in at the last minute. It's we were just having trouble getting this one spot filled. So bring your questions next time. I'll cut out a bit early since we do have a board meeting today. We'll come back when Brian tells us to come back. Thanks, guys.